There are no simplistic answers to whole school transformation, and again, I think that's a very obvious thing. And anybody who comes along and says, "Well, this is the one thing," it's a nonsense. It's an orchestration of many different things. If you go on Wiki Questions, somebody's asked this: "Where did you get your name from?" And I think there are 3 answers, and you can choose the one that you like the best. The trouble is, I tell different people different things, you see, because I do a lot of storytelling, so I'm never too sure who knows which story. In my early life, I came from a little terrace. We were at the end of the terrace. 2 up, 2 down, tin tub in the backyard, a shilling in the metre. We had most houses or flats that you go into, there's stuff, like here, there's stuff. We had no stuff. Stuff is a sign that you're wealthy. If you're not wealthy, you have no stuff, you have nothing. You don't have books, you don't have newspapers, you have no magazines, you have no toys, you have nothing. You're lucky if you've got some furniture. So it was very poor. The first 6 years of my life were very poor, but we had riches beyond belief because we were read to. And a few years ago, I rang my mum up because I couldn't remember any books, but I know we were read to. And I rang her up and I said, "Well, what about the reading?" And she said, "There's a place you can get free books. It's called a library." And I remembered, it all came back to me. And if you come from a poor family, you will remember, went to the library, you remember, like me, how we used to go down and you could take out 6 hardback books. Wow! 6 hardback books for free and take them home. So yeah, what an extraordinary thing to be able to, children from poor backgrounds to have access to literature, because the books open up the world. And without them, without the library, I would not be here. No doubt about it. So whilst the first 6 years we were very, very poor, we had riches beyond belief. We had wealth beyond belief because we were read to every single night. And my parents were aspirational from us. They didn't have degrees, but we were going to get a degree. So they had a vision for us. I think that when you're looking forwards, things like the imagination and creativity, they are really important. But they are founded upon having some skills and some understandings. As I said earlier, you can't create out of nothing. You have to know some things and you have to be skillful. And for me, over the years, the talk, being interested in talk and how talk liberates us as human beings, and its relationship into the writing, the whole business of expressing ourselves, and the influence on that from the reading has become increasingly central. When I was a young teacher, there was a report brought out maybe 40 years ago, 30 years ago, called the Bullock Report. It's about that thick. It was all about language. And one of the heads who worked on the Bullock Report, this big national report about the state of language in English schools, Diana Hutchcroft she was called. And I was a young head teacher and she came to my school. And I was full of ego and I wanted her to approve of what I was doing. So I taught a lesson. Oh dear. And afterwards, looking for her approval, I said, "What did you think?" I was like a little terrier or something. And she looked at me and she said, "Who talked most in that lesson?" And I knew then. I did. And she said, "Who needed to talk the most?" And the children. And that was a very strong, a very salutary moment for me. And the work that I've been doing over the last 30 years or so since then very much has been thinking about the relationship between the talk and the thinking, which is related to, as we said, bringing ideas into being, be able to shape and manipulate those ideas, think together, sort of interthinking, where you get classes having a discussion or in staff room thinking together and taking our ideas, scaffolding each other's thinking in the way that we're doing now. so that we're almost like one brain. You've got your bit and my bit, and anybody watching this, they've got their bit as well. So we're sort of collectively thinking together, and how important that is and will be increasingly so in the future. But if we don't have words, we can't do that. And for very small children, the magic of the story, that's the other big thing. There is something that is difficult to define, but we know is hugely powerful about story, and actually and poetry and music and dance as well. But in particular the story. And when children learn their bank of stories, the way that enriches them and adds to their lives and helps them to be able to understand themselves and tell their own story and become characters within the different stories. That is something that has been central to mankind around the world. If you go back to all societies, they have, if you go right back, at their heart, you've got art, dance, music, song, religion, and story. And if our schools don't have story as a central part of what they do, then they are dry as dust and not worth having. And will never touch children's lives and change them in the way that schools like St George's changes the lives of those children. And if we could go into the homes and see what happens when those small children go home and tell the stories that they've learned from our traditions and from traditions around the world, we could go back and see that, the effect on those families, because those stories then can become part of the family's bank of stories, and it binds us all together. Story is something which, if we look around the world, it is one thing which will bring us all together, because in the end we are just human beings. We may look different, we may behave a little differently, we live in different parts of the world, but you take stories like Cinderella, they are found around the world. And this is because we are human beings and we are all very, very similar. And we will recognise our story in other places and other people. So educationally, putting story at the heart of your school binds us all together, brings us all together. And for me, education is about the human spirit and how you cherish it in yourself and in the children that you work with. The creative side of my life is actually part of the teaching. The two things work together. And I think when teachers are working at their best, when they're teaching English, it's when they bring together their own creativity and imagination into the process of working on reading and writing with the children. I mean, people often ask me, where did you think of it, or why did you think of it? And in a way, I didn't think of it. It's developed over 40 years. Probably the most significant, or the most interesting bit, perhaps, for many people who are new to the concept, occurred in about 2000, when I worked on a transnational project looking at learning a second language. And we had partners in Europe. Malta, Bulgaria, Italy, France. And we were investigating with teachers, how do you teach children a second language? Now, when I was at school, you learned banks of vocabulary. And we had the idea that the children would learn a whole text, a story. So you'd learn your story, well, we would learn it in English, but you learn it in your home language, and then you learn the same story in the new language that you want to acquire. And during the first year, we had 4-year-olds who were telling stories in French and making simple changes to them as well. And one of the things that happened that was unexpected was that it improved the quality of the writing. So this was 4 through to about 13. But the teachers started to report that when the children were writing, you could see the influence of the oral text in the writing. So you could see bits of vocabulary, sentence structures, patterns and ideas reappearing, and it improved the writing. So the government, at that point, the government had a department called the Innovations Department, which I love that idea, that a government would actually put money into innovation, and the idea that teachers could get some funding to experiment. I mean, how will we ever improve if we don't experiment? If all we ever do is what we're told, our standards will stay the same. We have to have people experimenting and innovating and trying things out. So we were given money to then take the simple idea of the link between the talk and the writing, talking the text and writing the text. And it is true, you can't write sentences unless you can say them, and you can't say them unless you've heard them. And for some children, writing formally it's certainly another dialect from the one that they use. And for some of them, it's almost a totally different language. So we start in Talk for Writing from the whole business of learning model texts orally, so that children internalise the vocabulary, the language patterns, the structures that they're going to need to succeed when they come to write. And that bit of Talk for Writing is absolutely fundamental. And it's the new bit that many people may not necessarily have thought about. So, if you take a school like St George's, what happens is over time they're learning each year, say, a bank of about 6 stories, and they will draw maps of them, and they will learn them orally with actions to support the meaning, the language, and make it memorable. They'll build up a bank of 6 stories. Now, if you do that over 6 or 7 years, you have a very large bank, say about 50 stories that the child has learned and knows by the time he leaves school. You add in non-fiction texts, you've now got over 100 texts. You add in poetry, it's rather like creating a living library inside a child's mind, because you can't create out of nothing. And the whole process of Talk for Writing, if you stay with the narrative, not only are you putting language and ideas in their head, but you're building up banks of characters, settings, possibilities, and you're developing the imagination, because the stories, ideally, are taken and explored through drama, through art, through dance, perhaps through music. So you're developing the imagination. Somebody said it today. I've been working today with teachers of children who are deaf, and she said, we have to give them an imagination. And that comes through the drama and through learning the story. So we build the imagination, we build the language they need to express themselves, and those two things come together, and you see the impact in the writing. So we go from the talking, then into the reading, and then into the writing. The reading is interesting because if a child has learned a story orally, even if they can't read well, they can read this because they know what the words are going to say. So it gives everybody, it's inclusive, it gives everybody access into written text. It's hugely powerful.
Rhino had a great big itch. So he twisted, he turned, he wiggled and he rolled, but the itch wouldn't go. Rhino searched for someone to help him.
And the impact comes after a few years. I mean, the impact is immediate, but it is a cumulative thing. And this is one of the things about schools like St George's, is that they have systems which allow for cumulative learning. So what happens with the 4 and 5-year-olds is revisited in the next year, it's revisited and it is built upon, and then it is revisited and built upon. And it's the cumulative learning that is giving them, in part, their success.
How to be a superstar. Would you like to be a St George's superstar? If so, these set of instructions will show you exactly what to do.
My kids, in terms of literacy, they were read to virtually since birth. So they had language repetitively, not only through talk, because we're chatty parents have chatty kids, it's a sort of obvious thing to say really, but they were also, not just the chat, it was also constantly being read to. They must have been read to 4, 5, 6, 10 times a day. And of course, little children, they get favourites, don't they? And anyone who's been a mum or a dad will know they go through a phase, if you read to them, where they say, can I have that story again? And they have the same story again and again and again. And I find that fascinating because all children who are read to, or who come from an oral storytelling culture, they all do the same thing. The age of about 2.5, 3.5, they demand a narrative pattern again and again and again. And that must be significant, otherwise all human beings wouldn't do it. And I think it is because the narrative pattern is the main way in which we understand ourselves and the world that we live in. We are constantly putting the narrative template upon life in order to explain ourselves to the world and the world to ourselves. It gives us metaphors so that we can cope with life and understand things. And people constantly reach for narrative. When things go wrong, what do? You sit and talk about it, and you retell the story of what happened. So that business of going through that phase where they acquire the narrative pattern, it's fundamental. But what we know is that many children don't actually have that opportunity. So in this country, only about half, about 53% I think it is, of kids have a regular bedtime story. Then once they come into school, between 4 and 7, that drops to about 30%. And then 7 through to 11, it drops to about 20%. So we've got a lot of children who aren't read to and may well not read much themselves when they're at home. Now, the reading is hugely significant, and the story is significant for a number of reasons. The first reason is, when you're read to or when you read, you learn to do what you're doing. Sit, listen, concentrate, and engage inside your mind. And that's an extraordinary thing. You know, if by the age of 5 kids come on into school and they can sit on that carpet, concentrate on what's going on, join in with it, that's a good starting point. It also builds, narrative also builds the imagination. I'll come back to that in a moment. We know it gives vocabulary and sentence structures that they're going to need, so it helps to make you an articulate human being. And if we go back to the abstract thought bit, the imagination, some research done back in the 1980s, they tracked, by Gordon Wells, they tracked children from 1 year old through to 11. And what they found was that children who are read to are the most likely to succeed in education. And it's sort of obvious why. It's because they know how to sit, listen, concentrate. They're used to sustained attention to something. And it's to do with language, because about 70 to 80% of your language comes out of reading. I mean, initially, obviously, it comes through talk. But the more children read in primary school, the more language they're acquiring. So we know it's important in terms of vocabulary development. And reading and vocabulary development and size of vocabulary are the two big indicators for educational success. The size of vocabulary at 3 will tell you how well a child's going to do at 11. The size of vocabulary at 5 tells you how well they're going to do in what we call GCSEs when they're 16. And the size of the vocabulary when they are 11 will tell us what their income is going to be. So vocabulary is really important, and vocabulary is linked to reading. And I'll just go back to so we know it gives you language, and anyone who's had kids knows that if you read to them. I remember Poppy when she was about 3, and we were reading, there's a series of books in this country about Postman Pat, the postman. And there was a knock at the door, and Poppy looked at the door and she said to me, "Daddy, it's a little bit early for customers." And that is a direct quote from one of the books. And then I started listening in to her talk. And what she was doing is she was taking words and phrases and sentences from the books that we were repetitively reading with her, and she was playing with them. They were being added to her vocabulary, and she was experimenting with them through her talk. So we know it's about vocabulary. The other big thing is abstract thought. So what Gordon Wells found was that you can predict how well children are going to do in school by the number of times that they've been read to. The more they've been read to, the more likely they are to succeed in education. And it wasn't just in literacy. They were more likely to succeed across the curriculum, and they were the first children to form abstract concepts. And I think it's to do with the imagination. In other words, if you're read to a lot, you're used to thinking about things in your head. So most language is concrete with children at home. So mum will say, would you like a drink, and there is a drink. So the words that we use are closely related to things that are happening or have just happened or about to happen. But as soon as you say, in a distant valley, there was a giant, there's no giant there. So you have to start imagining. And kids who do every day are doing lots of imagining, are developing the ability to think about things that aren't in the here and now. And follow a train of thought. To attentively hold something in your mind, inspect it, and follow a train of thought. And I think that develops the ability to think in the abstract about things. So what Gordon Wells found was that children who are read to a lot, for instance, will be more likely to make the move from counting conkers into using numbers, which are more abstract. So in other words, reading helps to make you brainy, which every teacher knows. But it's nice to have bits of research which say, yes, it does. Talk for Writing has been developing seriously over the last 15 years, since I did that initial research project where we were looking at the link from the talking into the writing. And I've now got about a dozen trainers who work around the country with schools and groups of schools. And we've got training centres. The training centres are places where teachers or people like yourselves can go and have a look and see what it actually looks like. Because I can talk about it till the cows come home, but you've got to go and see it. You've got to look at it, or watch films of it happening, and be ready to ditch one's prejudices, because these are schools which defy the common wisdom in education. So the first one was called Trevithick, and it's in Cornwall. The last year that the head was there, Kay, who now works for me, which is their loss and to the great advantage of many other schools. But the last year Kay was there, in terms of deprivation, it was third from the bottom in the county. And in terms of attainment, in reading and writing, etc., they were the highest attaining school. So you've got children from a very, very poor background succeeding better than everybody else in the county. So these are schools which will, and I always say to heads and teachers, you must put your prejudices, leave them in the car. When you go into that school, be ready to learn. You know, teachers will say, and I'm sure they say it in your country, I'll arrive in a school and they will say, oh, well, you've seen the estate. I hate that. Absolutely hate that. How dare they? And if you think that, then go and work somewhere else. Because we set the standard. If we tick work, which is low level, sloppy, we've decided that's all that kid can do. So I go back to Trevithick anyway. Children from very poor backgrounds, against all the odds, succeeding better than, it's something like 350 other schools, some of whom are in very privileged areas, and the parents drive up in the Volvos and the 4x4s, and they come from very wealthy backgrounds. Their kids go to ballet, they go to tap, they take them to the theatre, they have every advantage in life, and yet there's this school which was doing, in a really poor area, doing far better. So that was the first one. They used Talk for Writing in the same way that Jan did, very systematically, very thoroughly. That was the first one. And then I acquired two others, one in Bristol, big city school, and then one in Slough, Penwood. And these are all schools in very poor areas. And I wanted to increase the number across the country. So I tweeted. I tweeted and said, does anybody know any more Talk for Writing schools where it's absolutely marvellous? And I think Sarah Collymore actually spotted it, or maybe Sam spotted it, or one of the others. And I got a tweet back, and I thought, that's interesting. So we had an email exchange, and then I said, well, I'll come and have a look and see what you're up to. So I went and had a look, and you don't have to be in the school long to realise that, like Trevithick, or the other training centres that you go to, these are schools that are giving, it's what Jeff said, they're transformational places. These change children's lives. And And that's what Talk for Writing is about. It is about transformation. That's actually what education should be about. If education is not a revolutionary act, then it's not worth having. It needs to be changing children's lives. If all it does is duplicate and pass on illiteracy, it's not worth having. Talk for Writing is not, it's an idea, it's a concept, it's teaching strategies and approaches, but it isn't fixed. So if you went to different schools that do it, they will do it in slightly different ways. And I think that's important because all schools are different, all communities are different, every child is different, and the teachers need to be adapting what they're doing to meet the needs of the children. So if the approaches are not flexible and don't use what we call formative assessment, forming your next steps in the light of where the child is and taking the child with you, if it's not like that, it's not going to work terribly well. So overly rigid programs that teachers feel they cannot adapt in the light of the children that they have won't work terribly well. They'll keep the standards low. And it moves me because it matters hugely. And having, I see myself as one of those children. And I guess we all are involved in education for all sorts of different reasons. But my involvement is very much focused on those children, making sure they have a good chance in life. The idea that children from a working class estate, that we're not going to have all sorts of talents there, is just crazy. Just because you happen to be born into, a family with wealth, you may be somebody who's going to contribute hugely to society, you may not. But what I definitely know is that our great estates in this country, there are hundreds and thousands of children who, with effort, if we teach them well, if they're motivated, they're encouraged, if we get strong systems in school, these children can achieve. And that's what you see. This is why teachers have to leave their prejudices at the door. Be ready to have all your prejudices challenged when you go to St George's or down to Trevithick or any of the training centres, St Matthew's, the one I mentioned in Birmingham, because these schools are helping almost every child move on to be able to work well in secondary education. So yes, it's transformational, it's revolutionary, and that is our role, to be part of that. I can't see, if you're not interested in that, I don't know why you're in education at all. In fact, it must be rather painful for some people if that's not what you're there for. The way in which the school system works can feel for many people very punitive and somewhat negative. And I see my function as, I like teachers. I'm pretty tough with them. You have to, you've got to work. If you're prepared to work hard, try hard, we can work together. So, I'm tough with them. I have very, very high expectations. And if it's not good enough, I'm prepared to say so. But I also like them. There are not many people in our society who actually like teachers. If you read the newspapers and you listen to some of the politicians, you would think these were dreadful people. They're not. They're decent people. They're good people who've given up. Some of them could have done other careers, etc. So in the main, these are very, very decent people. And they deserve to come together, to be energised. We have a lot of laughs. We have serious moments. We have ups and downs. We might even shed a little tear. Because it does matter, when you're teaching, particularly when you're teaching reading and writing, you're teaching about life, about who we are as people. And we are growing and developing young people. And in schools, the senior leader teams are in the business of growing and developing our teachers. So one of the things that I do is I go around, I energise, I share, I hope I spread a little bit of joy, I encourage, I support. I like to winkle out schools like St George's and teachers, and one thing I've learned is if you have a fairly small group of people in schools and you keep nurturing those people, working with them, learning from them, then you get the echoes out. If you spread yourself too thin, you don't get the same effect. So whilst I will work around the whole of the country, I have my schools that I like to work with and go back and learn from them, and support and encourage and energise those people, because they are also working with other people, and that's how we create very strong networks. It's not done through spreading yourself incredibly thin all the time. If you take nursery education, for instance, it's probably the same over in the States, I don't know. But certainly in most parts of the world, nursery education, play is absolutely central. This is blindingly obvious. But the skillful teacher and the skillful school will cunningly be developing all sorts of concepts and attitudes and skills through the play. So some direct instruction and teaching is a good idea. And if people don't like that, then come and have a look at some of our schools. And we have film clips of, in St George's, of children and other schools, of children doing things like, in St George's I've got a film clip of the teacher doing some writing in front of the children, and they've learned Run as fast as you can, the gingerbread man. So they perform a gingerbread man, they sing a song, perform a gingerbread man, they're all standing up and doing it. And then the teacher was writing in front of them, "I can run fast." So it's the gingerbread man speaking a speech bubble. And so she says "I," so we'll start with "I." And she says, "Oh, we know this one." And all the children go, finger in the air. So it starts at the top and down to the bottom, across the top, across the bottom. And she writes that up. And then she says, "Oh, what do we need now?" And somebody says finger space. And then what's the next word? Can. And you can hear the children going, k, 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 ah, 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 So they are spelling the word out. But in other talk for writings nurseries, I've seen children, for instance, reading. I've seen children writing. Words like, the film clip we've got is that they write words like shop and ship. So they've got their mini whiteboards and they're carefully writing ship, like that, and they're 3 years old. And most early years educators, I think, would probably, many might not be aware that children from extremely poor backgrounds, some of them can do that. Not everybody, but some of them can. And why would you hold people back? And wouldn't that be a mischievous thing to do? So what we've learned is that if we provide some direct instruction in a lively, enthusiastic, engaging, enhancing, magical way, that many children can get going with reading and writing quite early on and be loving it. And what a wonderful thing to do. And as I said earlier, it opened up the gateway for me, and I want that for everybody. It's a sort of tempting idea to delay, but then we'd have to go and see what they were actually doing, you see, because people in this country often say, well, the French don't start formal education to so-and-so, or Sweden's often quoted. When you go along and actually look, they are doing actually all sorts of things that mean that when they start to teach them formally to read, it happens very quickly, because all the concepts and the skills have already been developed. So it's a tempting enough idea, but in this country, there are national standards and expectations. We don't have a choice about it. If you're in a private school, you do have the choice, and that may work well for some children. For my money, if a child can learn to read and write early on, let's do it. As I said, not every child can, but at least we can begin to put it their way. And if you go back to the whole business of the standards, if you look at St George's, in the last 4 years, pretty much every child has achieved the national expectation, with well over half the children on free school meals. St Matthew's in Birmingham, that's 78% of the children are free school meals, and they're the same. They get 100% nearly every year. The same with Trevithick down in Cornwall. So I suppose what that has told me is, for those children who come from very, very poor backgrounds, getting a good early start has paid off, because they're going on to secondary education as confident readers and writers, speakers, listeners, learners, and good folk too. So I can't see what's wrong in giving children access. Or put it the other way around, if you go on to secondary education, you're not very good at writing, then your heart must sink when the first teacher says, now I want you to write about it. And you failed. Within the first week, you sit there knowing you can't do it. How awful that must feel. So what we know from these great schools is that an early start actually has been no bad thing for these children. We are educating children for a future that we don't know much about. And if I go back to when we were in the end of the terrace, there's no way that I could have foreseen, what was going to be happening now. But if you think about creativity, the ability to bring into being fresh ideas that might be of some value, the ability to problem solve, all of those things which are going to be important, they all hinge pretty much around language. If you don't have language, you can't bring ideas into being, you can't think, and if you don't have sentences, you can't really manipulate your thinking or do what we're doing, which is a sort of thinking together. So the language lies at the heart of it, and if we send children on to secondary education without, so in a situation where they can't really read and write and do maths, they can't take advantage of what's on offer. And through visiting many, many schools and observing thousands of hours of teaching, one thing I know is sloppy teachers have sloppy children because they become a mirror of the person that they are with for that year. So if you have sloppy habits as a teacher, then the children will acquire sloppy habits. They learn it from you. This is such an obvious thing to say. But St George's is tidy, neat, well organised, everything has been thought about, every area is well used. So over the years, Jan and Sarah have developed the school, and I think Jan said to me on that first visit, or maybe the second, I have no grotty cupboards left. And it takes time to get to that situation where every detail has been attended to in the school, and that takes years to do that. So you've got the environment has been thought about and is well used. The displays have been thought about and are well used. Some of them are celebratory, but some of them are what we would call a learning wall, so that we have up on the wall, it's rather like a workshop, where we have up on the wall examples, models, reminders, things that are related to the work we're currently needing, so that if children forget what they're doing, they can look up and be reminded. So the environment is good, the atmosphere is very, very strong. Those two things are very, very noticeable. They have incredibly strong systems, and on all the schools that are successful, this is one of the things they do, they have strong systems for cumulative learning. So what happens here is revisited and built upon year after year after year after year. And that is partly why nearly all the children leave able to read and write. Because if you look at most schools, there's nearly always one or two teachers who aren't actually doing the school policy. There's a school policy, everybody's agreed to do something, and you've got two people who aren't doing it. So the children for those 2 years don't actually make the progress they could have. So when they leave the primary school, they're not where they should have been because there was slow learning at some point. And it's the head's job to make sure that doesn't happen, that we're all excited. And again, this is another feature of places like St George's. Why do the teachers love it? They love it because they know they're making a difference. They love that. Why else would you teach if you aren't making a difference to children's lives? This is the job. This is what we should be doing. And if we aren't doing it, if it's not working, whatever we're doing, we've got to take another look. And we need to go somewhere down the road and see what is working and bring it back and start to work on that and develop that ourselves. Teaching is a constant form of research. It's not static. We're learning all the time. St George's is slightly different to when I first met it 3 years ago because we've learned more. And we are constantly in the business of not just recycling what we did last year, but we are thinking about it, tweaking it, polishing it, in the light of what we've learned and in the light of the needs of this current group of children. So the school has a good environment, it's got a good atmosphere, it's got very, very strong systems, but the systems, whilst they are systems and fixed, they are constantly being refined and polished and honed in the light of the children and the learning that is going on. In other words, the children are learning and the teachers are learning and the school is a learning environment. So they have a professional development culture in which, led by the senior management team, people are thinking about their teaching. And because they're making a difference to the children, they want to get in there and get on with it, because this is really important and really exciting. To be in a school like that is, for a teacher, it's the most thrilling thing to know that you're making a massive difference to the children. So very, very strong systems. And I think the other thing is, this is very much reflected by the senior management team, is that they too have been able to go beyond the sort of received educational dogma and challenge it. So if we go back to the early years in the nursery, many people who are involved in that would say, and small children will do this, small children learn a lot through copying, through imitating. So if you do a lot of writing in front of children, they'll go and play at writing. If you read a lot with children, they'll pick babies will pick picture books up and go, and they're copying the adult. So with writing, they'll go off. If you do writing with them, say, let's make a story up, and the teacher writes it down, then the children will go and play at writing. But the problem there is, if you don't intervene in that, they will develop bad habits. So if the teacher isn't alert to helping a small child hold a pencil, if a child wants to make marks, weak habits can start at that point, because what are they going to do? They're going to hold the pencil like this, and they're going to go like that. And if you allow that to continue, say over a whole year, that's a pretty big habit that's been established over that year. And the problem with practicing the wrong thing, it begins to make it a bit permanent. You've got to practice perfection in order to get perfection. If you practice the wrong thing, then you've got a problem. And so in the early writing for the children, as just one tiny example of where Jan and Sarah and the team have really thought carefully about this. Yes, we want small children enjoying their writing and loving it, but as soon as they show an interest in this, and we started modelling, let's make sure that they begin to develop really good habits. So in St George's, on day one, they will start, or very early on, they will start to help the children learn how to hold a pencil correctly. And contrary to the views of many children, what we found is that many children, almost all, actually by the end of that year, have got pretty good pencil control. But if you let them just play without intervening, then you can set up all sorts of problems for yourself. The irony of the situation is that some people who come into our schools in this country and would say that what I've just said is wrong, they then go home to their own child and they help their own child hold the pencil correctly, and they read to their own child, etc. That's the big irony. And why shouldn't, some of the children in our poorer areas, they're not going to get this at home. We have to have it in school. And we did it with our children. As soon as they wanted to, make marks with the paintbrush, etc., we helped them hold the paintbrush. And that's what we're going to do in school. So they acquire really good habits. And there's nothing wrong in that. In fact, everything is right with that. So one of the things about St George's then is that the leaders are independent thinkers. And that's really important, because probably all professions have received wisdom and dogma. And as educators, we need to be constantly inspecting what we're doing and be interested in, actually, is that right? Can we do better? What would happen if? Let's experiment with that. Let's try that, and let's see where we get to. Let's see how far we can go with this. Let's not set a limit on what children can do. And that characterises the leadership. The other thing that characterises leadership is an absolute, passionate, intense obsession with, and real focus, that these children are going to succeed from this school. And without that, our schools will be nothing. So the head has to have a big vision. If the head doesn't have a vision, then we've got a problem. And it's often why I send heads to schools like St George's, because they need to raise their game. And it works best, as I said earlier, when the head visits and gets excited and think, oh, this looks good. I want this for my children in our school. If they can do it in St George's, they can do it in St Matthew's in Birmingham, and down in Old Park, and over in Penwood, down in Trevithick, up in Selby, they can do it in my school. We can do this anywhere. Almost every child, unless they've got pretty severe special needs, almost every child can succeed in education. There are no simplistic answers to whole school transformation, and again, I think that's a very obvious thing. And anybody who comes along and says, "Well, this is the one thing," it's a nonsense. It's an orchestration of many different things. So we have to have systems, but not any old system. They have to be systems that are actually going to work. So if you look at the phonic work that goes on in the school, the way in which the school does it works. I know it works because the children learn to read and write, and the phonics is part of that particular journey. So you have to have strong systems that work. They have to be thoughtfully refined. You have to have the vision. You have to have the environment. It's an orchestration of many, many different things. And it's not simple, and it takes time. And the senior leadership team need to think together, work with the staff on that. And I think it does help if schools also have an outward eye and an interest in what is going on elsewhere. And this is why I like to work with schools and with clusters of schools, so that we learn together and we share our practice and we surprise each other. And that's partly why in Talk for Writing we try to bring people together so that we can share practice. But whole school transformation is not a simple thing. Perhaps I should end by saying if you're going to transform a school, it won't happen overnight. It takes a long time, and you have to be emotionally resilient and emotionally intelligent. You have to know in your heart, we can do this. We can do this, and we are going to do this, but we will need to stick at it. Change is a process. Initially, often people get excited, and nearly always as a difficult bit. And you have to work through that struggle to come out the other end. The key thing for me is we have to change the habits. We have to change what teachers do. Because sometimes I can change their understanding, but that may not alter classroom practice at all. And there's always a gap between what you know and what you do anyway. So you have to change what they do, the habits that they have in the classroom. Change the practice. The deep understanding and beliefs and all of that can follow on later on, but you've got to change what they actually do. So we start doing things that work and stop doing things that don't work. But it is a complex process and it does take time, and there are no simple solutions to it. If I look back over my own career, I was lucky enough early on to have a number of people who, like Diana Hutchcroft, who inspired me. And I think teachers deserve that. And if you come on a training day that I do, if you meet me in the corridor beforehand, I'll be quite sort of quiet and a little bit shy and nervous. And then I get up on that stage or whatever, and I take a deep breath, and I energise what I do. People are kind enough to say that the work is uplifting, it's inspiring, and Jan used the word wellspring. They like to come back for that, to have their souls uplifted, their spirit uplifted. But it's also through the work, because Talk for Writing works. It is one of the only things, if not the only thing I know, that actually can make a massive difference to children from backgrounds where they don't get read to and there isn't much interactive conversation. So you come along, you have a day, at the end of it you feel uplifted, but you go away with materials and approaches which will work, and that inspires the teachers as well. The other thing which I think is interesting about being a writer is, and this happened to me yesterday, I was up north and a head teacher came up with one of her younger teachers and said, "Oh, you know, Tracy sort of, you know, she thinks you're absolutely, I've never met her. She thinks you're absolutely wonderful." And there's this girl sort of blushing a bit, so, "Oh no, don't do that," you know. What she's done is she's read lots of my books. And so I was saying to her, our minds have met. We've never met, but our minds have met because you have read my words and you've engaged in your own mind with that. So through the magic of the word, we have actually met, our minds have met. And I'm happy that that has inspired and uplifted people and given them strategies and approaches that will work even in the most testing of situations. What a privilege to be able to go around, inspire and uplift other people, particularly teachers who are doing such an important role. What a real privilege to be involved in that and able to do that and do that for other people so they can go away, go back to their own schools and feel enriched, feel uplifted, feel encouraged and press on with the job. How lucky. If I had wings. If I had wings, I would touch the fingertips of clouds and glide on the wind's breath. If I had wings, I would taste a chunk of the sun as hot as peppered curry. If I had wings, I would listen to the clouds of sheep bleat that graze on the blue. If I had wings, I would breathe deep and sniff the scent of raindrops. If I had wings, I would gaze at the people who cling to the earth. If I had wings, I would dream of swimming the deserts and walking the seas. If I had wings.